You may have seen the headline, Viagra, the cancer breakthrough. Erectile dysfunction pill meets tumour biology in the same sentence. It sounds like clickbait. It isn't. It's a real study from a serious lab in a serious journal. But what that study actually found and what the headline is letting you assume are two very different things. I'm a family doctor, and on this channel we don't just repeat the headline, we slow down and work out what the evidence underneath it can actually show. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what's solid here, what's still a guess dressed up as a finding, and what I'd actually do with it if you asked me in clinic. So I'm going to show you what the lab actually found, why the human data needs a lot more caution than the headlines gave it, and where this fits into a messy, decade-long history between this drug and cancer research. And then I'm going to give you my thoughts about it. In July, a team led by Dr. Yarden Aryav in Professor Ayelet Erez's lab at the Weizmann Institute published a paper in Cancer Research, the Journal of the American Association for Cancer Research. The paper's title is, wait for it, PDE5A inhibition restricts cancer metastasis by disrupting NPC1-mediated cholesterol trafficking through a non-canonical CGMP-dependent pathway. Not exactly built for a headline, which if anything is actually a decent sign. The less a title is trying to sell you, the more likely the science underneath was left alone to just be science. There are really two separate studies stitched into this one paper, and they don't deserve the same level of trust. One is a laboratory discovery, a genuinely new mechanism tested in mice and in human cancer cells, and the other is a population-level observation, a look back through health records to see whether men who already took Viagra had different cancer outcomes. Now, I want to start with the lab work. It's the stronger half by a long way. We already know roughly how sildenafil, otherwise known as Viagra, works. It blocks an enzyme called PDE5, phosphodiesterase E. Blocking PDE5 lets a signaling molecule called CGMP build up. In the penis, more CGMP means more blood flow, and that's the mechanism that you may have already heard about, and that's the whole reason that Viagra works for male erectile dysfunction. What this team found is that CGMP does something else entirely inside a cancer cell, something that nobody had described before. Cells store a lot of their cholesterol in little recycling compartments called lysosomes, and they normally ship it out to wherever it's needed, the cell membrane, the mitochondria, through a transporter protein called NPC1. Think of NPC1 as the exit door. The researchers found that CGMP binds to NPC1 and jams that door shut. Cholesterol gets trapped inside the lysosome. And here's the detail that made me sit up. NPC1 is the same transporter that's broken in a rare genetic disease called Niemann-Pick type C. So functionally, sildenafil, Viagra, is giving a cancer cell a temporary drug-induced version of that same disease. So here's a little recap. Block PDE5, CGMP builds up, CGMP jams the cell's cholesterol exit door shut. Now, why would that matter for cancer specifically? Because cancer cells trying to metastasize, to break off, to squeeze through tissue and set up somewhere else in the body need a lot of cholesterol. It's a building block for the flexible membranes that they need to move, and it keeps their mitochondria running efficiently. If you cut off their access to it and their ability to migrate and invade, then will drop sharply. The researchers also found that cancer cells were unusually vulnerable to this because they tend to run with lower baseline lysosomal activity than normal cells. They have less capacity in the first place to root around the blockage. And here's a little detail that tells you that this is good science rather than a sales pitch. The cancer cells don't just sit there and starve. They actually try to compensate, switching on a separate pathway to manufacture fresh cholesterol from scratch, which is exactly why the researchers then added a statin, a cholesterol-lowering drug that blocks the manufacturing route. So sildenafil, Viagra, blocks the exit door, and the statin blocks the factory. Together, in their models, the effects on the metastasis was bigger than either drug alone. Now that's an elegant and testable story. It held up across multiple mouse cancer models and in human cancer cell cultures. This half I trust. It's exactly the kind of hypothesis-generating basic science that a good cancer lab is supposed to produce. It's also, so far, entirely a lab finding. Nobody has given this combination to a cancer patient and watched what actually happens. That matters for what's coming. Now, For the part that actually made the headlines, the researchers also pulled a database about 5 million patient records spanning 20 years and looked specifically at roughly 40,000 men who'd been diagnosed with cancer. Men who'd used sildenafil or Viagra before their cancer diagnosis had better overall survival than men who had not. And the benefit looked even stronger in men who'd also been taking the statin, which lines up nicely with the mouse data. Now, that is an interesting hypothesis supporting signal. It is definitely not proof that Viagra helps cancer patients live longer. Here's why, and this is the part of the whole story I most want you to walk away holding on to. First, this only looked at use before diagnosis. It tells you nothing about giving Viagra to someone who already has cancer. One of the study's co-authors, Summer Hayek, an epidemiologist, said, "Our study did not examine whether giving Viagra to patients after they are diagnosed with cancer improved outcomes. These findings are encouraging, but they do not mean cancer patients should start taking Viagra." Second, this is an observational retrospective association, not a randomized trial, and there's an obvious confounder sitting right in the middle of it. Who takes Viagra? Men who are healthy enough to have erections in the first place, healthy enough to go and get treated for a quality of life issue, and engaged enough with the healthcare system to ask for a prescription in the first place. That's already a healthier, more health engaged group of men before anyone looks at their cancer outcomes. Epidemiologists have a name for this. It's called healthy user bias, and it can produce exactly this kind of protective looking signal even when the drug itself is doing nothing at all. Another recap, the men taking Viagra were not a random sample. They were already on average healthier men, and that alone can fake a survival benefit. Third, and this one's easy to miss, the population studied was almost entirely male because that's who gets prescribed Viagra, which means human survival data tells us nothing about whether this actually plays out the same way in women, even though the lab work in mice included breast cancer models. Now, none of this means that the finding is wrong. It means that it's a signal worth chasing with an actual trial, which is exactly what Professor Erez has said needs to happen next. She specifically pointed to a planned trial in triple-negative breast cancer. Please comment below if you've seen other old drug does something unexpected to cancer headlines, because I keep finding more of them and I want to work through the good ones on this channel. Now, here's the thing that I think is most useful to show you. This exact drug has had a messy back and forth relationship with cancer research for over a decade now. And that is a genuinely good lesson in reading evidence carefully instead of reacting to whatever headline landed today. Back in 2014, a study in JAMA Internal Medicine found that men who'd used Viagra had a higher rate of melanoma, the dangerous skin cancer, with roughly 80% relative increase in risk. Now that sounds alarming, and it was also based on just 14 melanoma cases in the men who'd used the drug. It was just one study and a fragile one even at that time. And if you look at the actual numbers behind that relative risk, in absolute terms, melanoma incidence went from about 135 cases to 216 cases per 100,000 person years. So it's still a small fraction of a percent, either way you look at it. Nowhere near as frightening as 84% increased risk, which is how it made it sound so dramatic. So another recap, relative risk tells you the ratio, absolute risk tells you about how many people it actually happens to. But you need both, or the number is lying to you somehow by an omission. And later, bigger analyses walks it back further. A 2025 genetic study using a method called Mendelian-randomisation, which is considerably better than a standard observational study at separating true cause from coincidence, found no real causal link between PDE5 inhibitors and melanoma at all. The leading explanation for the original signal, men on Viagra, probably just see doctors more often and get more skin checks. You find basically what you're looking for. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ledger, a mouse study found that low-dose Viagra cut colon polyp formation roughly in half in a colitis model. A 2020 Swedish study in Nature Communications using national registries linked PDE5 inhibitor use after a colorectal cancer diagnosis to about 18% lower risk of dying from that cancer. And a 2025 cohort study of well over 200,000 men found PDE5 inhibitor use linked to a striking survival advantage across several male-predominant cancers, 5-year survival around 94% versus 87% in the comparison group. Two things were here on those last two. First, both are men prescribed the drug after their diagnosis, which is the same healthy user problem that we spoke about earlier, arguably sharper. A man well enough to be prescribed and tolerates an erectile dysfunction drug shortly after a cancer diagnosis already on average doing better than one who isn't. Second, that 94% versus 87% gap is a big number for an observational database study. Big enough that part of me actually wonders whether it's genuinely showing something real or whether it's just the same bias showing up again, just that it's dressed differently. I don't think we know yet, and neither, to be fair, do the people who ran it. So what you're actually looking at isn't one clean headline, it's more than a decade of a mixed evolving evidence base, signals pointing in both directions, almost all of it observational, none of it yet confirmed by a proper randomized trial. The new Weitzman paper is the first to offer a plausible biological mechanism that ties a lot of this together, and that is genuinely valuable. So where does this actually leave us? Well, the mechanism is genuinely exciting science, a brand new pathway connecting a decades-old erectile dysfunction drug to how cancer cells manage cholesterol. And that's the kind of discovery that can eventually lead somewhere real. And the lab work behind it deserves credit as careful, unglamorous science. The human survival data is a hypothesis. It is not a treatment recommendation. It's built on the same kind of associational data that has fooled medicine before. The 2014 melanoma scare is a near-perfect example of a frightening-looking signal that mostly evaporated once someone actually checked it properly. The same caution has to apply here, even though this time the story is flattering, a drug helping instead of hurting. If you're watching this hoping I'll tell you to start taking Viagra to prevent cancer, I won't, and neither would any of the researchers who actually ran the study. It's a prescription medicine with real side effects and real drug interactions, and self-medicating off the back of one observational analysis is not a good trade for anyone. What should happen next is an actual randomized trial, ideally in people who already have cancer and not just a look back at people who happen to be taking it for something else. Erez has already pointed toward exactly that in breast cancer. Now, the honest headline here isn't Viagra fights cancer. It's closer to a well-known drug just revealed a completely unexpected trick, and scientists now have a real reason to go and test it properly. That's still a great story, it just doesn't need to be exaggerated. This is The Accidental Doctor, a place where we try to make sense of uncommon sense medicine. If this was useful, stick around and think about subscribing. I go through research like this regularly, separating the actual signal from the headline noise. And if you've seen other old drug, new cancer trick headlines you want fact-checked, there are what the comments are for. And if this video has been valuable to you, please see these two over here. Stay well, ciao for now, and I'll see you in the next one.